3, hit it!
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to today's Caffeine for the Soul. And the title of today's episode, if you recognize it, you'll recognize it from the 1980s movie Gremlins, which I hadn't seen since the 1980s, and we watched with the family at Christmas. It turns out it's actually a lovely Christmas movie in a really dark way that you couldn't get away with now. But the essential plot, such as it is that there is this lovely creature. If you remember the kid's toy of Furby, looks a lot like a Furby, or not unlike the Ewoks from Return of the Jedi. And you know, Dad gives this to his son as a Christmas present. But there are 3 rules to this living creature. One is they don't like bright lights. The second is don't get them wet. And the third is don't feed them after midnight. And that's the most important rule. And so as you would expect, very quickly he accidentally introduces a bright light. And it goes, bright light! And it gets scared and backs off. And then a friend comes over and accidentally gets it wet. Well, it turns out that what happens when you get it wet is it multiplies. So what was one of these cute little creatures now becomes 10 of these cute little creatures. Although as they multiply, they get a little less cute and a little weirder. He understands the most important rule, don't feed them after midnight, but they're very clever and they trick him into feeding them after midnight, all but the original one. And they turn into these evil, dark gremlins that are just pure sowers of destruction and misery and death. And much hilarity ensues. But the reason that we're talking about this in the context of Caffeine for the Soul is that it's actually a brilliant metaphor for how thought works. So, thought is this gift. It's this creative tool of imagination. It's fun. It's something to play with. It's something that can keep you company and be a good companion. But if you get it wet, now what's the equivalent of getting thought wet? Well, when you really start thinking about stuff, when you dwell on it, you kind of almost obsess about it. You think about it and you think about it and you think about it. So it's almost like you're dipping it in a dark room when they would put the photographic paper in the developer fluid. Like it's when we hold a thought in mind, it's like we're dipping it into the developer fluid of consciousness, and it multiplies. One thought becomes 2, becomes 4, becomes 8, becomes 16, becomes 32, becomes 64, and so on and so on and so on. So the more you dwell on a thought, the more thoughts around it come, and they tend to go off a little. Like they're not quite what you were originally thinking about. You may have originally just thought, oh, I wonder if there's enough money in my bank. And then suddenly it's like, oh, I wonder if there's enough money in the world. I wonder if there will be enough money in the world. And they don't necessarily turn dark, but they expand. And then if you feed them after midnight, if you think about them when you're tired or low or hungry or just any out of sorts in any way, they turn really dark really fast. And they turn on you, or it feels like they turn on you. But here's where the first rule, that they don't like bright lights, comes in handy. Because when you really look directly at thought, when you look directly at imagination, it's like shining a bright spotlight on a movie screen. It's not that the movie disappears, but you can barely see it anymore. It dissolves in the light, because movies, as thoughts, are just games of light and shadow. And the more light, the less shadow. So a pretty good rule of thumb, if you want to get a little more elegant in your management of your own thoughts, is don't get them wet, which means don't overthink things, because when you do, they multiply, and the littlest thing can start becoming many things and can start getting more and more complicated. Don't feed them after midnight, because there's just a certain time when I was I remember one of the first deals I made with my brain when I found out you could make deals with your brain was I used to struggle sleeping because I would worry about money. And then one day it occurred to me, what if I just make a deal with my brain that I won't think about money when I'm going to bed? Once I'm in bed, money's off the table. And for whatever reason, my brain agreed to that deal. Like, it was fine with it. And so I stopped particularly worrying about money. Well, whatever occurs to you to do, to not go to those thoughts when you're, after midnight literally, or after midnight in the sense of being kind of caught up and already a bit low about things and already a bit down, they won't turn into gremlins. But if they do, it's okay. Because in any moment, you can just look directly at them and see them for what they are. They're the creative power of thought come into form. They're light and shadow. And when you look at them directly, you realize they have no substance of their own. They have no life of their own. And if you stop giving them life, they literally disappear. Have fun, learn heaps, happy exploring, and I'll talk with you soon.